Hi everyone, it's Ellie and welcome to the Curious Geographer. Super excited to have you here, and I'm so looking forward to my upcoming interview with Professor Mark Maslin about his book. If you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit subscribe and also check out the previous events. These are ones from last term, and there will be a new poster out soon, so definitely check that out. So today we are so lucky to be joined by Professor Mark Maslin, who is a professor of Earth. You probably hear my dog there. Professor of Earth Science Systems, Earth System Science at University College London, so UCL. Mark is a leading scientist and has an interest in past, global, and regional climate change, and has published loads of papers, has written many books, and has written loads of articles, which you might have seen in the New Scientist, The Times, Independent, and Guardian. But we're going to talk about one of his books. You might also have heard of Climate Change, a very short introduction, The Human Planet, but today we're going to talk about how to save, got that right, how to save our planet, the facts, and its little handbook of what we can do to save our planet, and kind of thinks about kind of positive change we could make in our kind of climate crisis. And so I'm going to pass over to Mark first, who's going to introduce himself, and then we're going to dive into some questions about the book. And if you haven't got one, you can start to order one now to read it, because it is very good and it's quite short as well. So lots of like packed full information. So let's hand over to Mark. Mark, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do in your day-to-day life.
Well, thank you, Ellie, for having me on. As you know, I'm a passionate geographer, so to actually be on your sort of show and actually talking to geographers it's brilliant. So where did I come from? So I'm a geographer by training, but actually what I do is I look at climate change both in the past, the present, and the future. And I'm not really sort of like I don't have boundaries. So I've been studying sort of like early human evolution and how climate has actually caused us to become human in Africa, all the way through to understanding the future of the planet, climate change, and the new period that we're in, the Anthropocene. So, as an academic, I get to play and do lots of things. I also get to teach some incredible geographers. And I also, on the side, run a company, write books, write articles, and come on wonderful shows like yours.
Brilliant. And today we are going to be speaking, as I said, about this book, How to Save Our Planet. And so what I wondered, first of all, is this book is written slightly differently to a normal book. First of all, you don't have to read it in order. And also, well, Mark, can you tell us, how was it written and why did you write it like this?
Okay, well, I was struggling. I was struggling to communicate climate change. And I wanted to communicate with like friends of mine who play football. You know, sort of like I wanted to give them a book. And I was actually thinking about books that I'd written, books that friends of mine have written, and they're all worthy books. We've all seen them. You know, they're in the school library, they're big, thick books, you know, by Michael Mann, Catherine Hayhoe, you know, sort of like even Bill Gates has written a book on climate change. And I actually wanted something that was a little easier to read. It wasn't threatening and actually was full of positivity. And I was listening to a podcast, and as you do, I was listening, and it was In Our Time by the BBC, and it was about one of my favorite books. It's The Art of War by Sun Tzu. So this was written 3,000 years ago, and it is literally a general or generals, we're not sure if this was a collective, writing down bullet points about how to win a war. Wonderful statements. Do not have men on ridge with sun behind. Have more spies than the enemy. Do not attack unless you know you can win. You know, really wholesome statements. This book is still used by the US Marine Corps. It is still used by the British Army to train people. And I thought, hang on, why don't I write a whole book in single sentences, all fact based, all with a reference at the back? I went to my agent, you know, and went, hey, look, I've got this brilliant idea. And she just looked at me and went, sorry, what? I went, no, it really, it will work. And she went, write me a chapter. It's like, me? Write a chapter? I don't do things like that. So I wrote a chapter. And she took it and she went, I can see where this is going, but could you actually write a few chapters? Because I'm not sure the publishers will be interested. So I wrote a few chapters, I sent it off to a lot of publishers, and they got really excited. And Penguin basically said, look, we really want to take this book. And that's how the book came about. But the stupid thing is that I was reading one of the chapters because you have to proof the book so many times. And also I wanted to double check every fact, make sure it's all supported with a reference list at the back and make sure it's all okay. But I suddenly read it through and I went, oh, I've just made one giant Twitter thread. So the weird thing is that there was me thinking I was so intellectual that I'd taken the power of the ancients from 3,000 years ago and funneled it into my book. And actually, really, all I'd done was just written a social media book for the 21st century. But it does mean you can start anywhere in the book. You can grab any chapter you're interested in. So if it's individuals, chapter 7. If you're a company, chapter 8. You just dive in there to which bits you actually enjoy. And the other thing is it's a flicking book because, as you notice, it's got big quotes all the way through. So you can just flick through and go, ooh, that's a good quote. I'll throw that onto Twitter, Instagram, or Snapchat, or whatever you want to do just to get the message out there.
It is really, really good, and as you said, you can just flick through. And I like what you're saying, almost like a Twitter feed. You can actually see my post-it notes of different parts on it, of like ones I want to use to reference. So let's kind of dive into some questions about it. One thing I really liked about your book was that you consider alternative futures at the end of the century. So what I wanted to know was, in your alternative futures and the nightmare year of 2100, if we do nothing, how, first of all, how did you get to these futures? So there's a chapter really where it kind of says, like, if we don't do anything, this is what's going to happen. So how did you get to them? And what worries you most about the nightmare future scenarios?
So the really great thing about being a scientist and a geographer is that I work with a whole global community of experts. These are scientists working on the chemistry of the atmosphere, they're working on the circulation of the ocean, they're working on climate modeling. And when we put that all together, and the really nice thing is that every 6 or 7 years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change pulls all the science together on climate change and synthesizes it in a huge volume, which came out last year in 2021. And there's an executive summary that gives you all the facts. And the nice thing is then they have computer models, which there are about 40 groups around the world of some of the brightest people on the planet who are building these climate models to actually understand what will happen in the future. Now, the interesting thing, and the thing I keep saying to students, is the science in these models is really, really good. We understand how greenhouse gases work. We understand thermodynamics. We understand the circulation of the ocean. What the biggest error is, what will people do by 2100? And so what we have are scenarios or stories which says this is how much we are going to emit. Are we going to emit and keep pumping out carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, or are we starting to green the economy, or are we actually going to try to stick to the Paris Agreement, which was agreed in 2015 by all the leaders of the world, and try and keep climate change to 1.5 degrees? And we use those to drive the models, and then we see what happens to the planet. And that's where I got the nightmare scenarios, because when you look at a scenario when we do not curb our emissions, you can see the huge changes in droughts, floods, storms, wildfires all around the world, and the impact it has on people. Again, one of the biggest concerns is sea level rise. It could be a meter and a half, maybe 2 meters by the end of the century if we do not curb what we're doing. Now, this is not the end of humanity, okay? So do not go for those doomsayers that says all humans will go extinct. Absolutely not. But what it's going to do is increase the amount of human misery on the planet. It is going to actually threaten the natural environment even more than we're doing now. And it's going to take us to societal and I would say, ecological tipping points, which we really do not want to go near.
Thank you, and I think, and as you said, like the amount of resources or like data modelling you do is really fantastic, and something which students get a taste of at school. But actually, when you get to university, and we'll talk about careers later, like a huge amount of modelling goes into it. Another chapter you looked at was the taxonomy of denial, including science, economic, humanitarian, and political denial. So I've got two questions. I'll start with the first one first. Do you have a standout denial statement that you cannot quite believe?
So the biggest denial now, it's not the science, not the humanitarian, it is the financial. And so what you're hearing, lots of people whispering, going, oh, well, we cannot afford to go net zero. It's going to cost our society too much to actually save the planet. Now, that's a really interesting thing because you need to pick that apart. There were two things. One, poverty is actually a political decision. Okay, so when these politicians are saying it's going to make people poorer, no, political decisions make people poorer. Because if you think about it, we in the UK are the 5th richest country in the world. There is no reason why we should have poor people. There is no reason why we should have children in extreme poverty. There is no reason why we should have food banks. So when they use the poverty argument, you can ignore that. But let's have a look at the economic argument. So hard-nosed economists, who basically only think about the dollars, they say if we do nothing about climate change, then it's going to cost us 20% of GDP in 2050. Now, that's a huge amount of money because, of course, guess what? The economy is growing at 3% every single year. If we do it now, it would only cost us 1% of world GDP to basically change our infrastructure from fossil fuel to renewables. There's also a little positive on that because the Downdraw project also says if we decarbonize properly, and we do it with all the win-wins. So it improves people's safety, improves people's health, and actually will make them wealthier, then we can save $46 trillion. Now, that's half the world's GDP in 1 year. That's a huge saving. So not only is actually going net zero incredibly positive for society and people, we can do it in a way that lifts people out of extreme poverty. We make it a better, safer planet. At the same time, we might even save a few pennies.
Save a few pennies. Those are big figures you've just said, Mark. Those are big numbers. So leading on to the idea of denial or people not believing in climate change or the consequences, I wondered if you had watched the film which has recently come out called Don't Look Up. And I wondered whether you thought this film would reach any people who don't believe in climate change, which is kind of one of the aims on looking at how like a disaster, the meteoroid might change people's views on like environmental events. So can you tell us about that?
Well, I was very lucky. Netflix contacted me and asked me if I wanted to go to a premiere, and I went, yes! So I saw a preview of the film in a little cinema in the Soho Hotel in a basement. Weirdly enough, it has red leather chairs, and then it has fake cowhide chairs. It's a very weird cinema. And you can also drink in there, so that was good for me. And it was full of incredible journalists and colleagues of mine. And I went with a wonderful colleague of mine, and we laughed all the way through because we understood this was an analogy to climate change. And when there's this wonderful scene when they say there is 100% chance that this meteorite is going to hit the Earth. And the president, she turns around and goes, should we just call that 70%, sort of, because you're never 100%. And it's a bit like when climate scientists for the last 30 years have said, we are 100% certain that you put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it will get warmer. Ooh, could we just say it's a 50-50 chance that it might get warmer or colder? It's like, no. And so there's so many wonderful analogies there. The only problem, I think, with the film, and I think it's a great film, is that I'm not sure that everyday people will get the climate change connection. They will see it as a brilliant take on the Trump era politics. They will see it as a real sting in the tail to neoliberalism and unfettered capitalism. But I'm not sure that other people will necessarily link directly and go, oh, this is all about climate change. So I think that's the only real problem. And again, I think a meteorite is a real instant impact, to use a pun. Whereas climate change is actually nefarious because it's slow. It actually affects people in different parts of the planet at different times. And actually, I think that's the insidious nature of climate change, is because it actually creeps and actually will affect different people in different parts of the planet at different times. And therefore, we don't see this is the start of the end. And I think that's something that's really different. And that's why we have so great difficulty communicating it to people, going, look at this event, and then trying to put it all together.
That's really interesting hearing what you said, the comparisons with the percentages, but then also like the differences, as you said, is the kind of the slow impacts of, well, the slow impacts for some people of climate change. However, it's much more rapid, where other people are seeing it actually impact their day-to-day lives. Thank you for sharing that. I think Leonardo DiCaprio is like his personal interest in climate change. Obviously, like if people don't know that as well, you might not also make the link potentially as well. If we get onto a bit of nitty gritty from what people can do,
yes.
You say in your book there are kind of like 3 different roles: individuals, governments, and companies, and we all must act. Can you tell us a little bit about each of the individual roles of those 3?
Okay, so you're absolutely right. So the way we're all thinking about it now is climate change has to be dealt with by governments, by companies, and by individuals. So we take governments first. Okay, some governments are better than others. We've seen this in the pandemic. We've looked around, and I think the interesting thing about the pandemic is it's made everybody realize that when the chips are down and something really bad happens, the only group of people that are going to look after you are governments. It's not the companies. Many companies literally went to governments and go, please, sir, could you give us some more money to bail us out? So it's interesting. The pandemic shows that if you want leadership and you want a way of thinking about all the people instead of just a few people, then that's where governments come in. And some have been better than others. So what do we need governments to do? So governments need to lead. So, of course, they can tax, they can actually incentivize, they can actually subsidize, they can remove things like fossil fuel subsidies. And weirdly enough, there's a whole new era of sort of like economics that's showing us that actually governments drive innovation. I'll give you an example. Why, within less than a year, did we have a vaccination for COVID? It is because governments have been funding medical research since the Second World War. Okay, they have been constantly funding it, funding innovation, etc. It wasn't private companies. No. It was governments funding universities to do blue skies thinking, because you never know when it's going to be useful. Absolutely perfect idea of how you support society. So again, they also need to do that because they need to incentivize companies, both through taxation, through sort of like money, through sort of like different schemes. So that's fine. We also need companies. We need companies to step up and realize that this is where their dynamicism, their entrepreneurism, and the speed that they can change is required. And they have that incentive from individuals, governments, to change. And we're seeing it. I mean, I've been very lucky to work with startup companies and billion-dollar companies who literally are going through that sustainable, amazing revolution. And they are seeing that actually not only do the people that work for them enjoy working for them now because they're an ethical company, but also they are making more clients and they're actually making more money. I mean, I'll give you a classic example. Microsoft declared 2 years ago they're going net carbon zero by 2030. That's great. I have to say, even my own university has declared that. But then they said something really radical. They said between 2030 and 2050, they're going to suck out all of the carbon pollution they put in since the founding of their company in 1975. And they're also going to suck out all of their supply chain and value chain for that period of time. Now, just think how many Microsoft items and goods there are out there and how much that's going to be. Huge statement, because basically what they're saying is, we're Microsoft, we will be here in 2050 and we want a nice world to make profit in. Perfect. And then come the individuals. This is where the real power is, because this is where people can demand change of governments and companies. So the first thing that I have been so proud of is the new generation. The young generation have gone out there and they are now shouting very loudly saying, you old people, you have mucked this up. Could you start to fix it before we get into power? I mean, looking at Glasgow and the COP26 last year, on Friday was the Friday strike, and the streets of Glasgow filled up with young people saying, we're taking a day of school because we want to save our planet. I thought this was huge. I didn't think this could be bettered. And then on Saturday, the whole of Glasgow shut down. Not only those young people, but they inspired people in their 80s, people with babies, people with children, sort of like trade unionists, sort of like everybody was out on the street. And the whole of Glasgow came to a standstill because these were just normal people demanding change. So that's incredibly powerful. The other thing that everybody can do is spend your money wisely. Choose what goods you do. Reduce the amount of consumption if you can. That's all brilliant. But when you do buy something, buy it from an ethical company. Buy it for a company that's sustainable. I know it's not always easy to actually choose that. And the other thing is, let's be a little bit selfish. Let's also have a plant-based diet, because that's going to make you healthier. That's going to make your family healthier. You're going to live longer. You're going to need less of the NHS, which will save us money. And you're going to save the planet as well. Now, before I get lots of rants about I love meat, so do I, okay? But what you do is you have it as a treat. You have it like once a week, and then you have it once a month. You basically make sure you look after your body. You have a lot of plants in your diet, and then occasionally, if you have to, you treat yourself to that very good piece of meat or fish, whatever you would like. It's a balancing act, and I think that's something that we need to actually learn. So yeah, the tripartite, government needs to lead, companies need to be dynamic, and individuals need to demand change now.
And so I just muted you and me instead of the other way around. That's great. Is it an equal tripartite, you said? Are all three as important? Is there one, do you think, that is the most important?
So that's a very difficult question to answer because, again, it's about what do you mean by importance? What do you mean by power? And this is something that students should always tackle. Ultimately, the most important is government, because if government actually regulates, taxes, incentivizes, then the whole country, say UK, we could go completely carbon neutral in 10 years if they so wished and they put in the right regulation. So, okay, so that's the power there. But the interesting thing is companies also have power because they can actually make government do things. They can actually demand change. And also a lot of companies are just saying governments are too slow. We're doing it ourselves. So there's a whole revolution. If you think about it, one of the largest companies in the world is an electric car company. Okay. So you suddenly have this change in global economy. We also now know that renewable energy is much cheaper per kilowatt hour than fossil fuels. So, anywhere in the world, if you want to put in new energy, it's really simple. Renewable is going to be cheaper. But please do not forget the power of people. People en masse, particularly when we're lucky enough to live in democracies, that people power. People actually vote, people actually make noise, and people change. And the really interesting thing is that politicians want to have legacy. They want to be remembered by history. They want to be remembered fondly. And the interesting thing is when young people go on the streets going, "You are all rubbish," that is not a good legacy. And so it's interesting because that youth voice has been so powerful in the last couple of years because it also resonates because most politicians are parents. Most CEOs are parents, and they basically are being nagged to death about changing their evil, unsustainable ways, which is brilliant. Okay, so if every kid nagged their parents to death about this, then we will see a huge change. If they also nagged their parents about how we could actually change the system and make sure that we lifted everybody out of poverty, that would also work. I am a great, great believer in children's nagging power, having two myself.
So, kind of to go on to from that, you say we have the technology, the resources, we have the money. Do you think we are making positive steps towards climate change? And what is potentially stopping us from making more? And just before you answer that, if anybody does have any questions, please put them in the comments and I'll ask Mark at the end. So, yeah, are we making positive steps towards climate change, or what is stopping us from making more positive steps?
Okay, huge question. So, yes, we are making small positive steps. So, if we look at, say, Glasgow, the COP meeting, the huge negotiation that went on just before Christmas, I summed that up by saying it was a small step forward with no backsliding. Okay, so there were more pledges. We were being more positive about trying to curb emissions. However, it is not far enough. So, one of the scary facts I always put out is at this moment in time, 80% of all the energy generated in the world is from fossil fuels. In the next 30 years, we have to get that from 80% down to zero. Okay. Humanity has never, ever undertaken such a huge, colossal change in infrastructure, in society, and how we actually produce energy. So it's a huge challenge. And the other thing I think that is holding us back is politicians. And what really frustrates me is we really do need a new type of politician. Just like we've got new academics, we've got new economists, we've got youth voice, we actually need new politicians that actually understand the win win win, which is if you actually decarbonize, there's so many positives. So if you remove coal-fired power stations from countries, you suddenly clean up air pollution. So all those people that were suffering and dying from air pollution stop. So you have that health. That health provides you with more money because they're not dragging money out of the health service, which is a huge drain on every country because it is a really important part of every economy. So you have all these wonderful win-wins. However, governments think short term. They don't think in that terms. I mean, we've got a government in the UK that is thinking about opening up coal mines in the UK, thinking about giving out sort of like new North Sea oil. At the same time as we are being sort of like almost blackmailed by gas prices globally, whereas if we converted completely to renewables in this country, we would be self-sufficient. We wouldn't have to rely on other people's gas, and your bill and my bill would not be going up by 50% in a few months. So that's a massive win. I mean, it really is. I mean, if I was a government, I'd go, quick, let's get all the renewables we can to get people's house energy bills down as quick as possible. And there's so many win-wins like this, but they just don't think like that. And it's a great shame. And I think we need a new generation of people that come in and go win, 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 win. Right, if we do this positive, this or positive, this or positive. And again, I go back to, oh, it's going to cost the consumer. No, that's just because you want to put the cost on the consumer. That's just because you want to keep people poor. We have enough money in this country to live everybody out of poverty if we so wish.
I've actually got a question to come in on that, which I think would link to that before we tangent to the next one, from Manisha saying, I know you mentioned about the UK, but how much renewable energy do you think we would need to reduce the impacts of climate change? I'm not sure if that's UK or globally, and I don't know if you have like the global idea or figures, but do you know the proportion that is made from renewable energy and whether that could be increased in terms of renewable energy?
Okay, so at the moment, I have no idea of the figures for the UK or globally. Globally, it is 80% of energy comes from fossil fuels and about 20% from renewable and other sources. And so therefore, we need to shift that. In the UK, it's much higher because we've been decarbonising since the 1990s. So we've been doing really well. And I love the graphs where they show every so often there's a whole couple of months with no coal. So one of the big shifts is we shifted away from coal in power stations to natural gas, which is much cleaner, much more efficient, and therefore you get more energy out. So the scale, however, is horrendous. And I think this is one of the reasons why scientists get really worried about countries still building coal-fired power stations, because they last for 50 years. So if you're going to decommission them in 20 years, that's going to be really difficult. Whereas if you don't build them and you build renewables, you're going to save yourself a lot of problems in the future and a lot of money. And so that's the problem. It's trying to move the money and move the ideas forward now. And I have to say, what's upsetting is we've been telling governments this for 30 years.
Yeah. Link,
Great
there's
question.
one final question, and then it's going to go to a question linked to GCSE saying, but from Pete, can the UK generate enough power at the moment only using renewable energy?
No, it cannot. So at the moment, it cannot. If you think about it, all our transport is petrol or diesel. All our airplanes fly on kerosene. Our houses are heated mainly by natural gas, or if you're in the countryside, oil. And therefore, we have to think of a way of shifting the whole of the residential sector from gas central heating to basically heat exchangers. Now, of course, there's an advantage of heat exchangers is, of course, they can cool down the house as well as warming it up. Now, what we should have done is already have building regulations that says any new building must have heat exchangers and have a heating and cooling system, but we don't. So again, these are things you can start to front load all these things. But at some point, we will be living in really nice housing stock, which is beautifully sort of like heated in the winter, cooled in summers as they get super hot due to those sort of like heat waves. And therefore, we will be able to look after people in a nice environment. So again, all these things are very positive.
So we've talked about renewable energy. You do this as a whole master's. Did you say master's unit earlier? We'll go back to master's.
Master's.
We do it as a GCSE question, and well, very obviously small analytical version of what you would do on your master's. So my question is mitigation versus adaptation. Which one do you think is best to reduce the impacts of climate change? You're probably not going to be able to answer that considering how you have a whole master's on mitigation versus adaptation, but our GCSE geography students would love to hear your view on which you think might be best?
Okay, so the interesting thing is it's going to be a classic geographer's answer. Okay, you just know this. So I'm very lucky. So we have a master's in climate change, and I do a special option course which is on mitigation and adaptation. So the answer is adaptation and mitigation. So the first thing is, do we need to mitigate? Absolutely. We need to take the carbon and greenhouse gases emissions now, and we have to get that to net zero by 2050 in 28 years' time. We need to crash those emissions. Otherwise, temperatures will go way beyond 2 degrees and we'll be dealing with real issues. Okay. However, climate change is already happening around the world. I mean, look at 2021 with massive heat waves. When you've got 49.5 degrees in Canada, you've got Siberia on fire, you've got droughts, you've got floods, you've got superstorms. You had all of this last year, already telling us that at 1.2 degrees warming, we're already having lots of effects. So adaptation is really important because governments have to look at how to protect their population. Now, the interesting thing is that we need adaptation anyway, because, of course, a lot of the people in this world live in abject poverty. Okay. One of the key facts that I always point out to my students is we still have 7 million children dying every year of preventable diseases and starvation. There are 825 million people in the world that go to bed feeling hungry. And we have 1 billion people that still do not have regular access to safe drinking water. So that's the state of the world. And we need to adapt already to protect those people from just normal storms, normal floods and droughts, normal catastrophes. So I would say that mitigation, absolutely, we have to do this. Otherwise, climate change will be an incredibly difficult thing for most people to actually deal with. We also need to adapt to the changing climate. We're seeing this everywhere. In the UK, we get warm, wet winters, really hot, dry summers, which we never used to. We're seeing all the way around the world that the rainfall is becoming more intense in shorter bursts. We need to adapt. So mitigation, long term, make sure we try to keep climate change contained as possible and keep global warming as cool as possible. Adaptation is because we must protect our people, we must protect our citizens as best we can. So it's not or, it's and.
Thank you. And I like that geographer response, as you said. It's not going to be as straightforward.
It's a very geography response.
I've got one question just come in, and then we'll round off with how you got to where you are. From Amelia saying, what steps do you think larger influential bodies like governments should be doing in order to help countries who are vulnerable or who cannot transition to change as easily as others? So I'm assuming who may not be able to transition to renewable energy.
Yep. Okay, so that's an incredibly good question and something that lots of people were talking about at Glasgow. So the first thing is that since 2010, the richest countries in the world have agreed to give $100 billion to the very poorest countries in the world to help them transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Okay, that's not a lot of money. It sounds a lot to you and me, but actually in terms of rich countries, it's literally loose change. But they haven't done it. They still haven't done it. So that's the first thing we have to do, which is force the countries to actually do what they've told us they're going to do, which is give the 100 billion. That's the first thing. The second thing is we need to deal with bankers and central money. So this is a really weird thing, is sometimes there are oddities in the financial system that give you the wrong outcome. So when I said renewable energy is cheaper than coal-fired power stations, that is correct. So if I'm a country and I'm say a president of a relatively poor, hopefully rapidly developing country, I will look at that and go, well, look, it's going to be cheaper for my people to have renewables, except to borrow the money from a central bank to build the infrastructure. They loan the money at a cheaper rate for the coal-fired power station than the renewables, which is madness. So what we're trying to do is now get really powerful people to educate bankers and educate central banks to say, look, you're skewing the system. We are making renewables so much cheaper, but to borrow money, it is cheaper to build a coal-fired power station just because it is 70-year-old technology instead of 30-year technology. You need to make the interest rates the same so people can make real financial choices. So they're really weird, odd things in the system. And this is why we need really smart geographers who basically go through sort of like university and get into government, because we need that sort of critical thinking that goes, you're being silly. We need to just tweak this and we'll get the right outcome.
Thank you for that. So on to our final question, and it links to quite a questions that also come in. We had quite a lot of interaction, so thank you everybody for being involved in the live chat with us. We ask all guests, how do they get to where they are? And then the question that's come in saying, when did you decide you wanted to get involved in climate change? So kind of, how did you get to where you are? Have you always been interested in climate change?
Right.
And then, do you have any advice for students who are making their decisions into further education or careers?
Okay, so I'm quite old, so I have to say my inspirations really came from sort of my family. So my family was relatively poor. We lived in North London, and my poor parents had to put up with two boys. So what do you do on a wet, cold, rainy Sunday? Well, you take your clapped out car, you drive down into London, park by the museums, because you could, and you throw the kids into the museum. So I basically spent many weekends in the Science Museum, in the actual sort of Natural History Museum, sort of like, occasionally I sneaked into the V&A, but not really my thing, sort of like, and therefore I was steeped in all of this. Also, I was of an age when I was a kid that we didn't have many channels. We actually had 3 TV channels. I know, shock horror. And one of them, I was watching Life on Earth. So this is David Attenborough's first major series. And this suddenly went, everybody in this country watched it. And it was just like, wow, the world is a really amazing place out there. And it's difficult to sum up how seminal that was. And this is partly why my generation just worships David's feet, because it just opened up new vistas. I then was at school and I worked out the way that I was going to escape home and actually make something of myself was to go to university. And weirdly enough, I sort of fell in love with geography because we went on a field class into Malham Tarn up in Yorkshire, etc. And suddenly it started to make sense, sort of like all the bits of the system. And I really loved this. So went to university, did geography at Bristol, survived that, came out of that, and then did my PhD on ice ages in Cambridge. And this was really interesting because I was looking at huge changes on planetary scale. Last ice age only ended about 10,000 years ago. So we have these huge changes. And that started me into understanding the climate system. And because that was the decade where huge increase in the worry about climate change, and that's when I started to see my role in understanding climate change. And really that was it, my PhD, and then sort of like working in Germany and then at UCL, this whole era and idea of climate change sort of built out. Because I had all this experience of how climate had changed in the past, I could then put this to work to look at all the different parts of the climate system. So, but really it came down to sort of like love of natural history, love of incredible museums, and basically David. It's all David's fault. So I'm here because of David. And you want some advice for
Yes,
young
please.
people, don't you? Okay, right. Take the subjects you are most interested in, okay? Don't take the ones that people tell you are good for your career. You will make a career, okay? So choose the subjects you most enjoy. take that, go to university if you think that's the right thing for you. Choose a course you are passionate about and you love, because you will make that a success. Whether it happens to be art, whether it happens to be biochemistry, whether it happens to be geography, you will make that career. And you can end up in amazing places. So for me, I love seeing some of my students come through. So for example, one of my students has now just become Sustainable Director of Stella McCartney. This is where geographers end up. We end up in fashion houses, we end up in banks, we end up in government, we end up everywhere. So I'd love to cheerlead for geography, because we do, trust me, we end up everywhere controlling most things. However, it really is about what you're passionate about. And also remember, clearly, university is not the right thing for everybody. There are lots of people out there who go, do you know what? Not right for me. I want to be an apprentice. I want to learn a skill. I just want to go straight out into the real world. The other thing that I've seen is that people will come back to education at different times. So if you don't feel university is right now, go out, earn a mint, do your life, go traveling, because you can always come back to university at a different time later in life when you go, right now I can think about things in a different way. One of my PhD students, he was a band member, he toured, he basically promoted bands, and then 10 years later, he done all that, went to university, became an undergraduate. Was quite interesting being 30 when they were all 20. But he's fantastic. After he did his undergraduate, we grabbed him and said, you're so bright, here, do a PhD. He's doing a PhD trying to understand how the circulation of the North Atlantic Ocean changes and how it could change in the future.
Wow, that was a great answer, Mark. So thank you so much. And I think that kind of really rounds up. I really love hearing some fantastic advice for students who are kind of making that next steps, and as often feels like they've got lots of pressure, but you're so right from the beginning. You've just got to pick something that you really enjoy, and then you'll be successful and in whatever you pick, and that is whatever that's to be.
Pick whatever is in here, whatever's in your heart, do it, because it'll be the right
and
thing
I just wanted to thank you so much for all your informative answers. It has been so interesting. I've really enjoyed it, and we've had so much interaction in the chat. So thank you also everybody for being here with us and asking questions as well. It really makes a really exciting live interview when our guests can answer your questions. So thank you, Mark, also for taking the time to answer everybody's questions. So a huge thank you from me and the guests. And this is the book, just to repeat to everybody. It's so good. Definitely check it out. But hopefully you'll get inspired from it. And I'm definitely going to use it in part of my teaching as well. So just to finish off for everybody, thank you again for joining me in a couple of weeks' time after half term. And I'll share the new live interview with you for that. So for me, have a lovely evening. And thanks everybody for joining live with us.